Welcome to Kinship Cafe. I'm your host, Jim Jones. I'm so glad you could join us again. We are continuing our journey through the Daodejing, and today we are in chapter 52. Let me go ahead and share the screen. Well, actually, just before we go into it, one of the things I'll say with this chapter that was interesting is there's a pretty sharp dividing line between camps in terms of how this one was interpreted. And so I'm actually going to present it twice, once from each way of interpreting it. And so you can kind of get a sense of the diversity of how these things are looked at. And as much as I really enjoy what the first interpretation has to say, I believe that it's more likely the second translation that's closer to the truth. So we'll have a chance to see how these things play out and get your thoughts on it as we go through it. So let's go ahead and jump in. The beginning of the universe is the mother of all things. And this will be the Feng in English translation that we're starting with here. So the beginning of the universe is the mother of all things. We have mentioned in the past the yin leaning or the reassertion of the yin perspective within that Taoist movement, looking at the yang again from that yin yang perspective of having a little bit too much or strong yang presence in terms of that control and that reasserting of more of that novelty of the feminine into it. And as such, the ways of referring to the Tao in many respects is feminized. And here we again see mother, much like we saw in chapter one. So here in this way of translating this passage, Tao is essentially personified as mother of all things, which would be in reference to the 10,000 things. So knowing the mother, you also know the sons, and the sons here would be that 10,000 things. Knowing the sons, yet remaining in touch with the mother, brings freedom from the fear of death. So here we've got this idea that if we understand that concept of the nature of reality, how Tao works, the absence and presence that with form and without form, that these things come together to explain how we see all the things that we see in terms of the suns, the 10,000 things, and that we have the ability to stay in touch with the source of all that. And when we understand that source and we see that we are actually part of that 10,000 things, then there's a sense in which we have or can have a different way of looking at our life in terms of seeing this ongoing transition, that this birth and death, as opposed to being just the beginnings and endings of one's lifetime, is actually something that happens continuously, and that ultimately what we were before is what we go back to in that sense. And it gives us, or it has the potential to give us, a sense of our place in the big picture, how we fit into the whole thing, and perhaps remove some of that fear of death. There's obviously different approaches to that. Some people are going to be much more concerned about end of life or a cessation of life. So I don't think it's just an axiomatic thing that just by knowing this, that this is going to remove that fear of death. But I think if one focuses on this, there is a way in which it can have a very different effect on how we look at the process of life and death and how we view ourselves in that whole picture. So I don't want to push that one too hard because I know there'll probably be some pushback, but it is possible. As someone who comes more from this perspective, I would say that it has definitely had that effect on me in terms of being much more at peace with how I fit into the big picture. I don't know, maybe we'll see if anybody else has some thoughts on that or things they'd like to bring up in that regard. It is kind of a big topic.
I'm curious, is there a stream of Taoism that would support or have a concept of life after death?
Well, oddly enough, and I don't know enough about where the religious version of it has gone, but I know in the early days there was a movement to try and figure out how to become immortal, but not in terms of life after death, but long life, in other words. And that led to some very interesting quest to try and find elixirs of life. Unfortunately, one of the early examples that they started to play with was looking at mercury as this elixir of life, which obviously doesn't work so well. But that would be one of the interesting offshoots. They do have an idea of the immortals, that are kind of like deities, but it's hard to see the the exact way they look at it is a little bit different than how in the West we look at like more of the supernatural or extra worldly or spirit versus physical. They tend to have, even in their idea of spirits, much more of a unified world view in which it's not two different worlds, but it's a single world, just different ways that entities would continue to operate within the world, maybe in different ways than they did previously, but it's not like a separate world thing. But that's definitely not my area of expertise. I am going to be doing some research into different ways of how they look at death within Chinese perspective during the Warring States period more broadly, but that's on my to-do list.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
That
Jeff,
notion of immortality being identified with long life just doesn't make sense. I mean, those are two opposite concepts, it would seem to me. But
it's kind of like the idea that you would just live as long as you needed to live or wanted to live, I guess.
yeah, I mean, that's not immortality by any definition.
yeah, Jim, I've heard, I've come across both interpretations of the Taoist immortal concept. The one being that, no, those old guys are still really living out there up in those caves in the mountains, and they just haven't bothered to come interact with the rest of society in a while because they don't care to. As well as the interpretation that no, silly, it doesn't mean they live forever in their physical body, but it means they cultivate their spirit to such a degree that it is able to continue existing or something like that. So the whether the Taoist immortal concept is supposed to be literal or metaphorical or figurative in some form, people seem to be of mixed opinions about. But what you're talking about before made me think of an answer I gave one time on a podcast that I was interviewed for. I think it's called "Let's Laugh About Death." Basically, the theme was kind of like dealing with life and death, and the host asked me, "What do you think happens when we die?" And I said, "From whose perspective?" And he was like, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, what happens to an ant colony when an individual ant dies? Nothing. It's still there. It goes on. It's like nothing changes. What happens to the whole of humanity when an individual person dies? Nothing. It's still there. What happens to the universe when a person dies? Nothing. It's still there." And he just found that answer so mind blowing. He was just like, "Wow, oh my God, I never thought about it that way."
Yeah, and that would definitely be much more along the lines of the Taoist perspective, right? And that we're just a part of the whole as opposed to, an individuated thing.
It's like it's kind of like who dies? Who's dying? Who are you talking about? You? Who is that?
Right. Yeah. And certainly there's other traditions that go along those same lines. So it's not unique to Taoism, but it is a bit different than the more traditional Western approach of this idea of life after death in terms of that dichotomy between physical and spiritual. So yeah, a variety of approaches to it.
Although I'm hearing from Dane that there is at least an element that has that dichotomy of spirit and body. If I'm hearing Dane correctly, that there's a certain element within Taoism that holds to that.
Well, the spirit within the Chinese perspective in general is not, at least to the degree that I've been able to discern so far, is not the same as our split worldview of having a spiritual world versus a physical world. It's within the physical world that these spirits are operating. So it's still a this worldly thing. It's just different ways of being involved in the world, I guess you could say. I don't know, Dane, did you have some other thoughts on that?
I'm not sure what you mean by the dichotomy between spirit and physical, or what was it you said?
Yeah,
Well, I was hearing
world.
you say that there was one stream that said that while the body dies, they have cultivated their spirits in such a way that they carry on. So that would suggest to me a split between body and soul, spirit, whatever term you want to use.
I see. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it could be interpreted that way. I was referring to how there's some people interpret it literally as, yeah, they literally are still alive and we just haven't
Right.
seen them in forever. And some interpret it as, no, it doesn't mean they literally live forever in their physical bodies.
Right.
You know, there are people who I've come across both interpretations. I would say it that way.
And it's that latter interpretation that I'm saying is open to a mind or a spirit body.
It implies that there is a spirit that can go on living after the body dies, you mean?
Yes, yes.
Actually, I was just thinking of something that I've heard Stan Groff say, kind of related to this. Stan Groff is the grandfather of transpersonal psychology, who said, well, if you think about if you think of yourself as a single, lone, isolated individual in the universe, then the idea of you existing for a while and then ceasing to exist makes logical sense. But he said the people who think of reincarnation as an individual spirit or soul entering one lifetime, leaving, coming back, entering another lifetime as a single separate individual are one step closer to the truth, but they don't go far enough, because it's not that there's like it's not that there's individuals on like the person level, and it's not even that there's individuals on the soul level that go in different bodies or lifetimes. It's that really it's all just one single consciousness manifesting itself in different ways. So in a sense, I think that people say, some people are skeptical of past lives and say, gee, it seems like everybody was Abraham Lincoln in their past life. And I'm like, yeah, we all were, and we're all each other right now, all the time, and for the entire future. Like there's only one of us here.
Interesting. Well, definitely a broad topic, and it can be explored in many different directions. Maybe I'll just say that in terms of the Daodejing itself, it doesn't seem to elaborate much in that direction. And so we'll just have to kind of leave it as maybe a bit ambiguous where exactly it goes. But we definitely see further directions in which it expands, both in more of a naturalistic way and also within more of a somewhat more traditional way of thinking about body and soul, or body and spirit. But I still would say that in general, the spirits within that more Asian perspective tend to be more this worldly involved instead of some other worldly involved. But I will report back on that as I look more
I think there's the distinction between philosophical Taoism and religious Taoism, I think, is kind of significant, because some people just interpret Taoism as like a philosophy and some people interpret it as more of a religion, and the
Mhm.
philosophical Taoists say all these like religious ideas came later after the Daodejing. They weren't really there to begin with. So that's also a distinction that exists between the philosophical and the religious strains.
For sure. And there are people who would argue that it was religious from the beginning, that there wasn't really a split or a change. So, there's somebody that has almost every perspective you could think of out there. So we're just gonna have to let that one lie for right now.
And regarding the Paleolithic, you keep mentioning how
Mm,
the Tao Te Ching is kind of referring back to this earlier Paleolithic pre-civilization time. Well, in that time, all cultures were animistic, meaning the world was full of spirits. So
yes.
it's
But
it's
but
much
again,
more than
it wasn't like an otherworldly thing. They were part
exactly. Yeah,
of
that's
this.
what I'm saying. The
Yeah.
world itself is full of spirits. It's not like some other spirit realm. They're all right here.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, let's continue then. So then it says, keep your mouth shut, guard your senses, and life is always full. So we'll come across this a couple of different times where there seems to be something about, stopping up the openings or somehow closing things, or in this case, shutting your mouth, guarding your senses. And as a consequence, life will be full. It's going to give us kind of the flip side here. Open your mouth, always be busy, and life is beyond hope. So, part of what we see frequently within other aspects of the Tao Te Ching is the allure of the socially constructed values that we are tempted to chase after, whether it's wealth or fame or status, possessions. They're saying that the more we get caught up in those pursuits, that the more our life is going to be, chaos of various types, or that we're not going to be able to hold on to these things, especially because things are constantly changing. It's also going to create degrees of social chaos because you're going to have, when there's inequalities of different kinds that happen, or if there's a limited amount of prized things, that this is going to lead to social disharmony. So within the Taoist thought, there's this idea of how do we taper those external desires that can be cultivated through culture. And part of it is, in a sense, being expressed here of how do we not let those things in. Maybe we could think about trying to close off these gateways or doorways to perception, in a sense of being enticed by these other ways of looking at things. There's an interesting parable that's told in Zhuangzi that I think is kind of related to this idea. And we touched on this a couple chapters back, but I want to actually present it here. So in Zhuangzi, he has a lot of these kind of fantastic stories, and things have interesting names. Let me just kind of read through this then. The Emperor of the South Sea is known as Change. The Emperor of the North Sea is called Dramatic. The Emperor of the Center is called Chaos. Change and Dramatic met every so often in the region of Chaos. Chaos always treated them kindly and virtuously. This again, this idea of Da, which would be that full expression of Tao in the sense of these processes that happen. Change and Dramatic said, everyone, meaning all the people, has 7 orifices so that they can see, hear, eat, and breathe. So this would be the mouth, the nostrils, the eyes, and the ears. Chaos does not have these. Let us bore some holes into him. Each day they bored a hole into Chaos, but on the 7th day, Chaos died. And so there's something about this perspective of what these openings allow for humans that are different maybe than the rest of the natural world, in that we don't see other animals or other creatures getting caught up in this pursuit of things like wealth and fame and all the pursuits that we might be encouraged to do. But if we were able to allow those same type of human features into the natural world, the idea is that it would be disastrous, that it would actually destroy what was there. And I think then the follow through for us is that we run that risk. The more that we're open to those things, then we have that same challenge before us. How do we keep from being destroyed by it? And frequently, I think when we see that idea of stopping up those holes or preventing things from coming in, it's in reference to this idea that chasing after these socially constructed values and goals is very destructive. So then it goes on and it says, seeing the small is insight, yielding to force is strength. So some common themes that we've seen in terms of, that in a sense, the insignificant is important, right? That small is not insignificant. Whereas we tend to chase after the big things or the grandiose things or the elevation. They'll talk about how water will go into the lowest places, that it will go where humans don't like to go. And so they want to see the significance in that small, of noticing the background, not just the foreground. And in doing so, the suggestion here is that this is going to bring insight, that we're going to have a greater clarity of how we look at our world. And then the same thing with yielding to force. So again, it can be perceived at a cultural level as weakness by being flexible or being able to adapt to the different situations. But within the Daodejing, this concept of adaptability and our ability to bend or be flexible is actually seen as a powerful thing, as opposed to stuff that's immovable or doesn't bend or is rigid, because those things end up breaking. And again, the contrast between water and stone and how these two things interact in our world. So then it's going to conclude, using the outer light, return to insight. So this might be the idea that by paying attention to what's happening in our natural world, that it's going to give us insights into how we contemplate, how we see ourselves, how we see ourselves in the place of this whole thing. And also it says, in this way, be saved from harm. So if we're going all the way back to the beginning of this, if we're staying connected to the source, and we see how all the children, in terms of the 10,000 things, are related to that source, and we don't allow ourselves to get caught up in chasing after these desires and socially constructed goals and values, then we're going to maintain a life of peace, that we're going to be saved in the sense from harm, meaning more specifically like needless things, right? So we're not going to suffer the effects of chasing after fame and fortune or glory or any of these things that can have devastating effects on us from a health perspective. And then
is there an aesthetic or almost Gnostic sense to this?
Well, I think there's an appeal to simplicity, which could be seen as ascetic, but they definitely did not have any of the, at least in terms of how we see the different communities that kind of grow up out of this Taoist perspective, they didn't have any of the concerns that would typically be associated with ascetics in terms of, not participating in sex or not participating in quality food or something along those lines. They would definitely see all those things as aspects of life and something to be enjoyed. So it's not, I don't think, as much ascetic as it is simplicity and not being fooled by false goals and illusions that the culture wants to hold up for you. And then the final line here, this is learning constancy. So this is, again, that character Chan, which we saw at the very beginning. You know, the Tao that can be followed is not the constant Tao. So the constant Tao, the only thing that really is this idea of constant is that there's change, right? That there's these patterns. And that's what we want to learn how to adapt to. So this would be that learning how to bend, learning how to adapt. The conclusion of this would seem to pull that all together in that same vein. So, and the other thing related to what you're asking, Rob, is sometimes there's in some strands, especially once you have the influence of Buddhism into China and you see the interaction of Taoism and Buddhism, the idea of desires comes into play quite a bit too. And I would say, at least at the early stage, there's not this idea that desire is a negative thing that we need to get rid of. They would still see desire as a thing that's part of the human condition or nature. It's just more a question of what is capturing our desires. Are we being captured by what's being handed to us from culture because it's trying to get us to conform to different ways of acting in society? Or are we keeping our desires based more on a natural approach from how we see the way everything interacts between the Tao and the 10,000 things and the idea of Da and that driving our desires in terms of how we act?
Yeah, yeah. You know, the other thing that troubles me a bit is that yielding to force. I just am not comfortable with that. You know, I
Yeah.
guess I'm more into resistance.
Well, it brings up a lot of questions too, right? So what happens if somebody's invading the country or invading your home or those kinds of questions? And I would say that based off of other things that we've seen in the Daodejing prior to this, it's not suggesting that there isn't ever a time to fight. It's just maybe strategies in terms of how that fight would actually happen, in terms of the different strategies that are used, but also recognizing that when things resort to violence, that it's always viewed as the worst possible outcome. Not that it's never necessary, but that it shouldn't be celebrated.
Yeah.
My Kung Fu teacher quoted a lot of sayings from the Tai Chi classics.
Mm-hmm.
And one of them was the three defects were resisting, using strength against strength, and getting rid of the opponent. Another thing you always said was don't resist and don't insist.
Mm.
The reason I'm mentioning this in the context of Kung Fu is because this can be interpreted not as a statement of pacifism, but more as a statement of tactics, because Kung Fu is about fighting, but it's about fighting the most efficient manner possible.
Yeah.
Which does not involve going strength against strength, but strength against weakness. And so, like the art of war says something like, avoid your enemy where they're strong, attack them where they're weak, and things along that line. So,
Yeah.
Yielding to strength does not mean surrendering,
Yeah.
generally.
Agreed. Yeah. Definitely. It's not a pacifist perspective, but it's not glorifying violence perspective. Okay, so this is the first and I don't know if it's the most common way that this chapter would be interpreted, but it's definitely a common one. So now we're going to look at the flip side of this thing. So you might recall that it started off by saying that the universe has a source. Now, for some reason, Feng and English like to translate a particular word as universe. And let me just kind of review this here. So we have two different phrases that get used within the Daodejing. One of them is Tian Di, which is the idea of heaven and earth. And this would be equivalent to how we might talk about the cosmos. But there's another phrase called Tianxia, which is all under heaven. And this then is usually in reference to the human sphere of the world, or sometimes it can be thought of as the social world, the realm of human interactions. And the term that was translated as universe in this passage that we just looked at is actually Tianxia. So it is maybe a little bit misleading in that regard, because Tianxia isn't typically viewed as this idea of the universe. It's more about either the empire or the realm of human interaction or the social world. And if we start with that as the premise, it's really going to change the whole dynamics of this entire chapter. So let's look at how that unfolds with a different translation, this time from Chad Hansen. So it starts off and says, the social world has a source. Now, this is very different, because if we're looking at the universe and saying the universe has a source, well, then we would be saying, well, yes, that's going to be the Tao, right? Or different ways that Tao is sometimes talked about as absence and presence, or that whole pattern between the two. But here, if we're saying the social world has a source, this isn't necessarily referring to Tao. This is going to be another question. This is going to be the kind of question of, like, where did society come from? Where did human organization come from? And that is saying it has a source. And in this sense, it's still using the word mother, treat it as the mother of the social world. But if we're now in reference to this question, whereas before, the idea of the universe having a source and the children being essentially the 10,000 things, here the mother is going to be that source of, in a sense, society, and then the children would be in reference to how that society unfolds. Since we have its mother present, we can use it to know its offspring. So how do we see the effects of that culture? How is that society or empire unfolding? Since we know its offspring, we can revert to sustaining its mother. So we wouldn't necessarily talk about how do we sustain the Tao, because that would be something that we don't actually have any control over. There's nothing we can do to sustain it. But if we're talking about a culture or a society or an empire, now there is a sense in which this makes sense, how we would be taking care of or concerned for this way of organizing how people are working together. And then it says, and we're not in danger till we lack being. And this is phrased a little bit awkwardly, I think, but the idea of lacking being would be essentially in saying until we die, right? Until we reach the end of our lifespan. But it's saying that we're not in danger would be how we're experiencing life within the empire or within that culture or within that nation state. And that's going to be based on if we're actually sustaining that mother, so that the offspring of that, the consequences of that, are something that's life affirming as opposed to life draining. So now when we're thinking about the body, we're not talking about individual people's bodies, but we're talking about the social body. And we're getting into the question of influences from outside versus inside, and how that's going to impact the experience of that social body. So when it's talking about then clamp its exchanges, close its gates, we could almost think of this as how we're protecting, in a sense, that the social body from outside influences. And if we're successful in doing that, it says we're never going to find ourselves striving all the way till the point that we die. We're going to essentially find ourselves living a life of peace within our society. But if it opens the gates, in a sense, that there's free exchange, and it's going to complicate its dealings, then it's going to say that we'll never find a way out of that toiling or that confusion or that restlessness all the way till the end of our life. And this is a very, almost can sound xenophobic, right? And that it's about closing the borders, not allowing access from the outside to come in and distort. And I don't know that they would have had a completely closed off view that there was no interaction with people from the outside, but they would be very suspicious of things that get imported. I would also suggest that this is reflecting on the idea of human society from an ideal perspective, not necessarily any perspective. So if you were going to be in the Warring States period, obviously there's a lot of confusion and chaos that's going on. Possibly they see this because of outside influences. So the decline of the Zhou Empire, which superseded the Shang Empire, or excuse me, conquered the Shang Empire, was seen as a relief because things had gotten out of control. It had become very oppressive. And so they were, in a sense, liberators. When we moved then into the spring and autumn period of the Zhou dynasty, it's after there was an invasion that caused the capital to move. And shortly after that, then we have the fuller decline that happens during the Warring States period. So perhaps they're looking at these outside influences that came into the Zhou dynasty that initially was something that was very positive, and that the invaders and the ideas that they brought with them led to what ultimately becomes the Warring States period. And so perhaps this is where they're looking at those, how do we stop up the openings kind of a question, right? How do we protect what was, or what they perceived as, a more highly functioning social arrangement in which people were thriving? Anybody have some thoughts on that? I know this is maybe a current question that we have in terms of what should our border policies be and how do we deal with outside influences. I know different cultures are wrestling with the influx of different cultural perspectives or religious perspectives that can come into a country and what the consequences of that are. What are your thoughts?
Jim, have you read Guns, Germs, and Steel?
Yes. What's
Jared Diamond?
Jared Diamond? Yes.
Yeah, I'm not sure where this fits in to overall Chinese history, but the book is basically about why it was Europe that rose up and basically conquered and colonized the rest of the world and not a different continent. And it kind of comes down to in Europe, because of the geography, there were all these different nations because of mountains and whatnot that had independent governments. And so if one of those nations decided it was going to go set up colonies somewhere, the other nations all had to do the same thing in order to stay competitive with it economically and militarily and otherwise. But because of the geography of China, basically it's just like one giant expanse that could effectively be unified and ruled as a single political entity. There actually was a period when the Chinese government sent out treasure fleets, which were huge fleets of ships, bigger than any that ever went out from Europe to explore and colonize and whatnot. But then there was a regime change or a political shift or something, and the emperor decided, no, we're not going to colonize, we're not going to go explore the rest of the world, and just shut the whole thing down everywhere for a very long time throughout the whole country. So therefore, while Europe was colonizing the rest of the world, China was keeping to itself because of just because there was like a single political decision that was able to be enforced over a large space in time because of it being a single unified entity. So I'm wondering if this uh, kind of political decision may have some Taoist influence behind it, because do you know who Monk Yunro is?
No.
He's a Taoist monk. He's a white guy. He's a Taoist priest who is basically banned from China because of the because of speaking out against the communist government. But he's said that that there's actually a long tradition of the Chinese government consulting the Taoist sages for advice, and he said there would, like, at the his teacher's temple in China, there would be these like black government limousines that would show up from time to time to consult with the master. So it seems to me it's like that that could have had maybe the governors at the time like consulted the Taoist masters about how to rule the country, and they said should close it off, and they were like, okay.
Yeah, it would be interesting to see what the implications of that are. I know there's been a lot of discussion, especially because, as you said, Dane, at that point where they were sending out these huge fleets, that, I mean, these were ships that I believe at one point could hold like 2,000 people, which dwarfed the best of what was happening in the Western world in terms of like where Christopher Columbus was at and so forth.
Yeah, it was the individual ships were larger, and the expeditions, I think, were larger too. They were like many ships at once.
Yeah. And so there was kind of questions about, well, if they had all this, technology and skill, how come they didn't end up, conquering the world? So one of the ideas might have been the question of geography and maybe political thinking in terms of staying closed off. But the other explanation that's been offered is that they didn't have an underlying value of how do we conquer and use and take up resources that was very different from the Western perspective, that was all about how do we continue to gain, and potentially that idea of from a more of a personal perspective, how they looked at trying to avoid the chasing after the glory might be something that was having an effect there as well, compared to what was happening on the Western side.
I'll admit I'm skeptical, because they sure seem to conquer their own continent just fine.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely ideas of how do we have that unity, and I think that's probably driving that, right? That they didn't want to have the differences in terms of the culture. But yeah, it's I think in general though, they did have more of a how the harmony with nature was much more of a driving force in Chinese thought in general. Whereas in the West, it tended to be much more divorced from nature. Nature became more of an obstacle or a thing to be conquered and controlled. And I think those fundamental underlying perspectives had a big impact on what their view was in terms of what should they be doing in the world.
I could understand how, well, in in Chinese culture there was Taoism as an influence, then later there was Buddhism, and neither of those things existed in the West prior to that. So certainly it's easy to see how those could have had an influence, but we tend to think, like, in modern Westerners think of China as this single entity, but it was many different peoples, ethnicities, cultures, empires that were conquering each other and taking over territory. It was like it was a whole world, really. So the the art of the China produced the Daodejing, but it also produced the art of war.
Yeah. Yep. For sure. So interesting thoughts about how these things unfolded in terms of history. But it gives, again, I think modern day questions about border policies, I think, can kind of come into play here in terms of how we can think about and evaluate some of those questions as well. So then it's going to continue. So seeing something small, call this discerning. So we're still wanting to pay attention to the details, even if we're talking about this from a cultural perspective versus an individual perspective. And then protecting something weak, call this enforcing. So this definitely takes on a little bit of a different angle if we're thinking about the those that are weak within the realm of the empire and how are those protected. And it becomes almost more of a duty then, as opposed to looking at this from the perspective of flexibility and adaptability, although those concepts don't disappear from the nation perspective, this particular line takes on a little bit of a different angle because it's looking now more at social policy. And then the conclusion, use its light and restore its discernment. So perhaps what we're saying here is the light from maybe the origins of that empire, getting back to its origins, considering the state of the Warring States period. Maybe there's a thought of how do we get back to that more ideal state? And then don't leave things to trouble your being. One of the ways that this is talked about sometimes is tackling things while they're small. Don't let them get big and out of control. And this is something else that we see brought up a couple of different times within the Daodejing as well. And then the final line, treat this as rehearsing what is fixed. So that's interesting. Chan could definitely be translated along those lines of fixed, but it's a curious phrase because we definitely see that this change and this impermanence is a key thing. So where is Chad Hansen going with this particular line? I'm not sure. But you still have this idea of practicing or rehearsing. And even if we were to bring it back into this idea of constant in terms of, how that ultimate view of Tao is concerned, maybe this is where that Tao part comes back into how a nation is structured and how things are run. So we've had two very distinct ways of looking at this chapter, one from more of a individual perspective and one from a more of a social body as opposed to a human body perspective. And it's kind of interesting to see how radically the translations and the interpretations can be for some of these passages. Hey, Taylor, you joined us.
Hello. Yeah, sorry, I was like,
No, no worries. So we've got a couple of minutes. Any thoughts on the distinction between those two? Did one resonate with you more than the other?
Well, and it seems that a lot of the passages in the Tao Te Ching seem like they could be easier to digest if they were interpreted as hyperbole. So maybe it's not that we're literally trying to live forever, but that we do try to live in the best way possible so that we'll naturally live a long and healthy life, as long and healthy life as possible. If you live well, you'll live a long and healthy life. If you don't, you won't, that sort of thing. So this idea, if it's interpreted as like just another one of these kind of hyperboles that's making this extreme statement that's really just indicated to kind of point the direction rather than be an actual ultimate destination or something like that. Well, yeah, it makes perfect sense to want to live as well as possible and see your grandchildren grow up and all that sort of thing.
Yeah, for sure. Anybody else have some thoughts?
I am finding that while this was a interesting topic that I could relate to, most of the topics since we switched to the part 2 has been more and more abstract, more and more philosophical than practical, if I can call the first one practical. And I'm having a much harder time relating to most of those topics. But today was actually pretty good in terms of, yeah, there's a lot to discuss about how you live your life and how it doesn't guarantee that if you live a good life, you're going to live a long one. But I'm finding overall that this was just one of those, hey, this is more relatable, more practical, more because relatable was the best word of all the other part 2 sections.
Interesting.
Yeah, I've heard of a Chinese blessing, supposedly like a ruler goes to visit a sage and receive a blessing, and the sage's blessing is grandfather dies, father dies, son dies. And the ruler's outraged at first, saying, how could this be a blessing? And the sage explains, well, if it happened in any other order, it would be a tragedy. That's the natural order that it should occur in.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, I think this will be a good point to bring it to a close. So if you've been watching this as a video and you'd like to be a part of our live discussion on Zoom, you can register your email at www.kinship.cafe, and you'll get an invitation to this Zoom, as well as information about where we meet in person in the Southern San Diego or Southern California area. And with that, I look forward to seeing everybody next time.
Thank you, Jim.